My name is Danielle Harris, and for a long time, I thought silence was strength. I thought if I didn't argue back, if I didn't complain, if I just stayed calm, my children would be safe. I was wrong. When I met my husband, he wasn't cruel. He was charming, funny, protective, the kind of man people trusted instantly. And when I became pregnant with our first child, he promised me the world. "You don't need to work," he said. "I'll take care of you." Back then, that sounded like love. What I didn't understand was that dependence can turn into a cage. From the outside, our home looked peaceful. A small house, children's toys in the yard, family photos on the walls. Inside that house lived 4 children, 3 little girls, 4, 6, and 8, and 1 baby boy, just 2 years old. And inside that same house lived fear. Not screaming fear. Not every day. The quiet kind. The kind that sits in your chest. The kind that makes you listen for footsteps. The kind that teaches you to read a man's mood before he opens his mouth. The abuse didn't start with hitting. It started with words. "You're too sensitive. You're useless without me. Who would want you with all these kids?" I stopped answering back. I told myself, at least he doesn't hit me. Then one day, he did. And after that, it became unpredictable. Weeks of calm, then anger, apologies, then blame. And I learned the most dangerous habit of all. I learned how to minimize my own pain. I thought I was protecting my kids by staying. But children see everything. They hear the silence after yelling. They feel the tension in the room. They notice when their mother smiles less. My daughters stopped laughing the way they used to. My oldest daughter, only 8, started watching the door when her father came home. My baby boy cried whenever voices got loud, and still, I stayed because I had no job, no money, no way out, and fear whispered, "If you leave, it will be worse." I told myself, he's a good father. But a good father doesn't terrify his children. I told myself, he loves us. But love does not bruise the soul. I told myself, I'm doing this for my kids. But the truth is, I was teaching them that pain was normal. That night started like many others. Dinner half eaten, the TV on too loud, my husband pacing. I remember my oldest daughter standing in the hallway, watching, listening, learning, and I remember thinking, she shouldn't be seeing this. I just didn't know yet that she would be the one to save us. I used to believe that if I stayed quiet, if I lowered my voice, if I smiled through the pain, my children wouldn't notice. But children don't need words to understand fear. They feel it. They breathe it. They grow up inside it. I became an expert at pretending. I learned how to cook dinner with shaking hands, how to clean the house while my heart raced, how to laugh in front of relatives like nothing was wrong. I told myself, as long as he doesn't hit me in front of them, it's okay. But I was wrong, because the damage wasn't loud. It was silent. My youngest daughter stopped asking questions. My middle daughter started flinching at sudden noises. But my oldest watched everything. She watched how I spoke carefully. She watched how I avoided eye contact when her father was angry. She watched how I swallowed my words. She became quiet. Too quiet for an 8-year-old. We learned to measure time by his footsteps. Heavy steps meant anger. Slow steps meant tension. Silence meant danger. I learned to read his face like a warning sign. If his jaw tightened, I stayed quiet. If he slammed the door, I kept the kids in their room. If he drank, I prayed. Every night, I prayed, not for myself, for my children. That night didn't start differently. Dinner was cold. The TV was loud. The air felt heavy. He started yelling. Not screaming. Yelling. The kind that cuts deeper because it sounds controlled. He blamed me for everything. The house, the money, the noise, the children. I stood there, silent, because silence felt safer than speaking. Then I saw her, my oldest daughter, standing in the hallway, barefoot, tears in her eyes, her hands clenched into fists too small for fear that big. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at him. And in that moment, I saw something change inside her. I didn't hear her leave the hallway. I didn't hear her pick up the phone. I didn't hear her whisper. But she did. She walked into her room. She closed the door. And with shaking hands, she called the police. When I heard the knock at the door later, my heart dropped. I thought, what did I do wrong? When I saw the officers, I felt shame before relief. Because deep down, I knew my child had protected me. When the police took him away, he didn't look angry. He looked shocked, like he never imagined consequences, like he never believed a child would be brave enough to speak. My daughter watched from behind me. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just asked quietly, "Mommy, are we safe now?" And I didn't know how to answer. That night, the house was quiet in a way it had never been. No yelling, no tension, no fear in the air. But the quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy. I sat on the floor and cried, not loudly, silently, because I realized something terrible. My children had been carrying my fear, and my daughter had become the adult. I thought the police call would end everything. I thought it was the breaking point, but I didn't know yet that the apology was coming and that I would almost let him back in. When he came back, he didn't come angry. He came quiet. That's what scared me most. He stood at the door with his head lowered. No shouting, no blaming, just tears. "I'm sorry," he said. Not loudly, not dramatically, soft, like he finally understood. He told me everything I had wanted to hear for years. That he was ashamed. That he hated himself for hurting us. That he was going to change. He promised counseling. He promised patience. He promised God. He looked at the children and cried. My daughters stood behind me. My son reached for him. And that broke me. Hope whispered, maybe this time is different. Fear whispered, what if you can't do this alone? And exhaustion whispered, you're so tired. I wanted my family whole. I wanted peace. I wanted to believe that love could fix what fear had broken. So I said yes. I told myself this time would be different. I set rules. No yelling, no drinking, no anger. He agreed to everything. For a while, he was perfect. Too perfect. My youngest daughter started sleeping with the light on again. My middle daughter stopped singing. And my oldest, she watched. She didn't smile when he laughed. She didn't relax when he hugged us. She stayed alert, like she was waiting for something to fall. Months passed, and slowly the old signs crept back in. A raised voice, a slammed door, a cold silence, then blame, then anger. And I felt it in my bones, that familiar tightening in my chest. The fear I thought I'd buried had just been waiting. That night, he came home late. His voice was sharp. His patience gone. The children froze. I tried to calm him. I tried to protect them. And then, everything happened too fast. I remember the wall. I remember the sound. I remember thinking, if I stay, this will never end. This time, I didn't wait. I didn't hesitate. I called the police. And when they asked me if I wanted him removed, I said yes with no apology in my voice, with no doubt in my heart. That night, I didn't just remove him from the house. I removed the lie that I could fix him. When the door closed behind him that night, the house felt empty. Not peaceful. Not safe yet. Just empty. I stood there in the living room with 4 children looking at me. No husband. No income. No plan. Just 4 pairs of eyes asking the same question. What happens now? And for the first time in years, I didn't lie. I said, we're going to be okay. Even though I didn't know how. People don't talk enough about what happens after you leave. They talk about bravery. They talk about freedom. But they don't talk about the fear that comes next. The fear of bills. The fear of food running out. The fear of doing it alone. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor next to my children's beds, listening to them breathe, making sure they were still safe. The next morning, there was a knock on the door. It was my neighbor, my best friend. She didn't ask questions. She didn't say, I told you so. She looked at my face and knew. She pulled me into her arms and said, "You did the right thing." I cried into her shoulder like a child. She helped me with everything. She watched the kids while I rested. She helped me fill out paperwork. She drove me to interviews. She reminded me that needing help didn't make me weak. It made me human. I hadn't worked in years. I was terrified. Who would hire a woman with 4 children and no recent experience? But I applied anyway. Cleaning jobs, retail jobs, office work, anything. And one day, someone said yes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. When I came home with my first paycheck, my daughters cheered. Not because of the money, but because they saw me standing on my own. My oldest hugged me tight and whispered, "I knew you could do it, Mommy." And in that moment, something inside me healed. Slowly, I started to remember myself. The woman I was before fear, before silence, before shrinking. I laughed again. I dreamed again. And my children felt it. The house felt lighter, safer. I thought rebuilding meant the hardest part was behind me, but life had one more lesson waiting. When love returns, carrying new questions. For a long time, I told myself I would never love again. Not because I didn't believe in love, but because I didn't trust myself to survive another heartbreak. My children came first. Always. Life slowly settled into a rhythm. School drop-offs, homework at the kitchen table, late nights folding laundry. I was exhausted, but proud. For the first time in years, the air in my home felt calm. No shouting, no slammed doors, no fear waiting for nightfall. Just peace. I met him quietly. No sparks, no dramatic moment. Just a conversation that felt safe. He listened when I spoke. He didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice, and most importantly, he respected my children. Not as baggage, not as obstacles, but as blessings. I didn't rush. I watched how he treated my daughters, how he knelt to their level, how he remembered their favorite snacks. I watched how he spoke to my son, gentle, patient, never demanding affection. And slowly, I led him closer. Before I ever said yes, I asked him one thing. Can you love my children as if they were your own? He didn't answer quickly. He said, I can love them for who they are and let them decide what I become to them. That answer stayed with me. When we married, it wasn't a fairy tale. It was intentional. We talked about boundaries, about trauma, about patience. My daughters were happy. They felt protected. But my son grew quiet. He stopped laughing the way he used to. He didn't reject my husband, but he didn't embrace him either. At night, I'd find him staring at his phone, messages, missed calls from his biological father, and my heart tightened. I realized something painful. Healing isn't linear. You can escape violence and still carry its echoes. My son wasn't angry. He was confused, pulled between the man who hurt me and the man who was trying to love him. I thought love would fix everything. I was wrong. I thought the hardest part was leaving. I was wrong. The hardest part was watching my child struggle with a past he was too young to understand, but too old to forget. My son didn't say much anymore. He answered questions with shrugs. He stayed in his room longer. He stopped calling my husband by his name, not out of disrespect, but out of loyalty. A loyalty tangled with confusion. One evening, while folding laundry, his phone buzzed on the couch. A name flashed across the screen. His father's name. My hands froze. I didn't read the message. I didn't need to, because I already knew. That night, I sat beside my son. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked, "Are you talking to your dad?" He nodded, and then he said something that cut deeper than any bruise ever had. "He says you kept me away from him." I felt my chest tighten. All those nights I stayed silent, all those times I protected them, all the pain I swallowed, reduced to a lie told gently to a child who just wanted his father. I wanted to scream the truth. I wanted to list every reason, every fear, every moment I broke. But I didn't, because I refused to turn my child into a battlefield. Instead, I said, "I never wanted to take your father from you. I just needed to keep us safe." He looked at me, not angry, just sad. My daughters noticed. They stayed close to me. They reassured my husband. But my son pulled away. And my husband, the man who chose us, who loved us, started questioning himself. "Maybe he'd be better without me," he said one night. That sentence terrified me. One afternoon, my son didn't come home on time. No call, no message. When he finally walked in, his eyes avoided mine. I asked where he was. He said, "With Dad." My heart sank, not in anger, in fear. I realized something then. You can heal yourself. You can rebuild your life. You can find love again. But your children heal on their own timeline. And sometimes the past doesn't knock. It just walks back in through a child's heart. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because a mother knows when something is shifting in her child's soul. The house was still. My daughters were asleep. My husband lay beside me, breathing softly. But my son's room, too quiet. No music, no movement, no light. Just silence. I stood outside his room. The door was slightly open. I knocked. No answer. I pushed it gently. His bed was empty. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I checked the bathroom, the living room, the kitchen. Nothing. Then I noticed it. His backpack. Gone. My hands shook as I dialed. 1 ring, 2, then, "Hello?" His father's voice. Calm. Too calm. "He's here," he said casually. "He wanted to stay with me tonight." I swallowed hard. "You didn't ask me." There was a pause. Then he said, "He's old enough to decide." Every cell in my body screamed, but I didn't argue, because the moment you fight, the child becomes a weapon. So I said, "I'll come get him tomorrow." Another pause, then, "Let him think for a while." I sat on the couch. My husband woke and saw my face. He didn't ask questions. He just sat beside me and held my hand. It wasn't that my son went. It was that he didn't tell me, that he packed quietly, left silently, like I used to do when leaving meant survival. I remembered my son at 2 years old, curled into my chest, holding my shirt tightly, back when fear lived in the walls and love lived in whispers. And I wondered, had I protected him, or had I taught him to run? The next day, I drove alone. No anger, no speeches prepared, just truth. When I arrived, my son stood at the door. He looked smaller, older, both at once. I knelt in front of him and asked softly, "Do you want to stay here?" He didn't answer. He just said, "I don't know who I belong to." That's when I realized this wasn't about his father. This was about identity, about roots, about a child trying to understand who he is and where he comes from. I thought bringing him home would solve everything. I was wrong, because the next decision wasn't his. It was mine. That day, I drove home with my son sitting quietly in the back seat. No phone, no headphones, just silence. But it wasn't peaceful silence. It was heavy, the kind that presses on your chest until you can barely breathe. We talk about protecting our children. We don't talk about this. Sometimes protecting them means stepping back. Sometimes love doesn't look like holding tighter. Sometimes it looks like trusting, even when it terrifies you. That evening, he stood in the kitchen doorway. My daughters were laughing in the living room. My husband was outside fixing the porch light, and my son asked quietly, "Why did you leave him, but marry someone else?" That question, it didn't come from anger. It came from confusion. I turned off the stove. I sat down, and I told him the truth. Not the adult version, but the honest one. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving your father," I said. "I left because love should never hurt." He looked at the floor. "But he says you broke the family." That's the thing about abuse. It doesn't end when the door closes. It echoes. It rewrites history in a child's mind. I took a deep breath. "Families don't break when someone leaves," I said softly. "They break when someone hurts." Then he said it. "He says you're trying to replace him." My heart cracked, not because it was true, but because I realized my son felt replaced. Before I could speak again, my husband walked in. He had heard everything. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. He knelt in front of my son and said, I'm not here to replace anyone. My son looked up, startled. I'm here to love you, he continued, even if you never call me Dad. Something shifted, not fixed, not healed, but softened. That night, after the kids slept, I made the hardest choice of my life. I called his father, and I said, he needs space to know who he is. There was laughter on the other end, arrogant, satisfied, but I continued. But this isn't a competition. If you poison him against me, I will end contact legally. The line went quiet. For the first time, I wasn't begging. I wasn't explaining. I was setting a boundary. And boundaries scare people who survive on control. I cried that night, not because I was weak, but because letting go hurts more than holding on. I cried for the boy who felt torn, for the girl I used to be, for the mother I was still becoming. I thought I had done the right thing. I believed patience would heal him. But I didn't know. The next thing my son would do would shake our entire family. That morning started like any other. I packed lunches, checked homework, kissed foreheads, reminded my girls to walk together, reminded my son to tie his shoes properly. He barely looked at me, just nodded, grabbed his backpack, and walked out the door. Something in my chest tightened, but I told myself, don't panic. You've learned not to panic over silence by noon. My phone rang. It was the school. My heart dropped before they even finished the sentence. My son never arrived. He never checked in. He was gone again. This time without a word, without a note, without fear, just absence. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, refusing to cry, refusing to break, because when you panic, you make mistakes. I called his phone straight to voicemail. I called his friends. Nothing. I called his father. No answer. That's when I knew this wasn't confusion anymore. This was manipulation. I drove to his father's place. My hands steady, my voice calm. The door opened, and there he was, smiling like he'd been waiting for me behind him. My son sitting on the couch, shoes off, comfortable too, comfortable, like he belonged there. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I didn't accuse. I simply asked, my son, are you okay? He nodded, but wouldn't look at me. His father leaned against the wall, arms crossed smug, and said he came on his own. He wanted to live with me. Now, he needs a real father, not a house full of rules and replacement men. That's when something inside me went quiet, not angry, not sad, clear. I looked at my son and said, you are allowed to love your father. You are allowed to visit him. You are allowed to ask questions, but you are not allowed to be used as a weapon. He looked up, startled. His father laughed and said, you don't get to decide that anymore. You lost that right when you left me. Those words didn't hurt me. They exposed him. I knelt in front of my son and said, I will always be your mother, even when you're confused, even when you're angry, even when you walk away. But I will not fight you. I will not chase you. And I will not let anyone turn you against your sisters, your home, or yourself. My son's eyes filled with tears, but he stayed silent. I stood up, looked at his father, and said, "Enjoy the moment. Control never lasts forever." And I walked out without my son. That was the hardest walk of my life. Every instinct screamed, "Go back, take him, drag him home." But love is not possession. Love is protection, even from yourself. That night, my house felt different. My daughters asked where their brother was. My husband sat quietly, knowing this wasn't something he could fix. And I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if letting go meant losing him forever. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the turning point, because the truth always surfaces, and when it does, children remember who stayed safe, who stayed steady, and who never stopped loving them, even in silence. 3 days passed without a word from my son. 3 days where I woke up expecting to hear his footsteps and didn't. 3 days where my daughters whispered his name like saying it out loud might bring him home. I didn't call his father again, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood something. Chasing chaos only feeds it. Instead, I did what I'd never done before. I documented everything: dates, messages, school, absences, emotional changes, things. I used to excuse away as boys being boys, trauma being temporary. I met with a counselor, not to punish anyone, but to protect my child. Then, on the 4th night, the call came, not from my son, but from the police department. My heart stopped before the officer even finished speaking. There had been an incident, domestic disturbance reported at his father's apartment. Neighbors called it in, yelling, breaking glass. My son wasn't hurt, thank God, but he'd seen everything again, history repeating itself in front of him like a curse. He couldn't escape. I drove there calmly because panic wouldn't help when I arrived. My son was sitting on the steps, wrapped in a blanket. Eyes hollow, not crying, just empty. His father was in handcuffs, yelling, blaming everyone but himself. The officer asked me gently, "Ma'am, are you the custodial parent?" I nodded, and in that moment, everything shifted. Papers were signed, statements taken. My son didn't speak a word the whole ride home. He just stared out the window at the streetlights passing by like memories he didn't want to revisit. When we got home, my daughters ran to him, hugged him like they'd been holding their breath for days. He let them. He didn't push away. He didn't smile either. But he stayed that night. I didn't lecture. I didn't say I told you so. I sat on the floor outside his room like I used to when he was a toddler. Just present. Just there. Sometime after midnight, he opened the door slightly and whispered, "Mom, I'm tired." That's when I knew the illusion had cracked. Children don't need perfect parents. They need safe ones. And that night, he chose safety, not because I forced him, not because I begged, but because the truth finally showed its face without me saying a word. And I understood then that love doesn't always win loudly. Sometimes it wins by waiting. The days after that night were quiet in a different way. Not the kind of silence that scares you, but the kind that forces you to sit with what's been broken. My son stayed home. He went to school, He ate dinner. He slept in his bed, but he didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He moved through the house like someone afraid of making noise, like a child who learned that sound can trigger storms. I didn't push him. I didn't interrogate him. I didn't demand apologies or explanations. I learned a long time ago that healing can't be rushed. It has to be invited. So I focused on routine breakfast at the same time. Dinner together. Phones away. Movie night on Fridays. My husband stayed gentle. Never overstepping. Never trying to claim space that wasn't offered. My daughters were patient in ways that amazed me. They included him without pressure. They talked about normal things, school friends, music, like they were rebuilding a bridge, plank by plank one evening. While I was folding laundry, my son sat on the floor nearby, not looking at me, just close. And after a long silence, he said, "Mom." I thought if I stayed with him, he would finally change those words, hit me harder than any insult ever had. Because that's the lie. So many children believe that their presence can fix broken adults. I sat down beside him and said softly, "You are not responsible for fixing anyone. You are allowed to be a child." He nodded slowly, like the weight of that sentence was settling into his bones. A few days later, his father tried calling from an unknown number. My son saw the phone light up and froze. I didn't answer. I didn't ask him to answer. I simply said, "You're safe here." And for the first time in months, he exhaled like he believed it. Therapy started, not dramatic, not magical, just honest sessions where he learned to name his feelings: anger, guilt, loyalty, confusion, things he was never allowed to express before. Some nights, he still woke up from nightmares. Some days, he still went quiet, but he no longer ran. And I realized healing isn't a straight line. It's messy. It's slow. It's choosing safety again and again. Even when the past keeps knocking, and that's when I understood something else too. I didn't fail as a mother because my child struggled. I succeeded because when the world hurt him, he knew exactly where to come back to. It took time before I understood this part. Not days, not weeks, but months. The kind of months where progress is so quiet, you almost miss it. My son didn't wake up one morning healed. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no sudden smiles. What changed instead was subtle. He started asking small questions, normal questions about homework, about dinner, about weekend plans. Questions rooted in staying, not escaping. He began sitting at the table longer, lingering after meals, listening to his sisters argue and laugh, sometimes rolling his eyes, sometimes smiling without realizing it. My husband stayed steady, never forcing affection, never demanding respect, just showing up every single day, fixing bikes, helping with school projects, listening more than speaking. And one afternoon, I overheard my son introduce him to a friend as my mom's husband. Not dad, but not a stranger either. And that mattered more than titles. Therapy continued, and one day, the counselor looked at me and said something I wasn't prepared to hear. "You've been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you. You didn't cause the abuse. You didn't cause the trauma, and you didn't fail because your child struggled to process it." Those words cracked something open inside me, because for years I blamed myself for staying too long, for leaving too late, for remarrying, for every tear my children cried. But that day, I let the guilt go. I realized survival isn't selfish. Healing isn't betrayal, and choosing peace is not weakness. Weeks later, my son asked me if we could donate some of his old clothes toys. He said he wanted to help kids who didn't feel safe at home. I didn't cry in front of him, but later that night I did, quietly grateful tears, because pain had turned into empathy and fear into awareness. His father stopped calling. Eventually, the chaos faded without drama, without confrontation. Just distance, doing what boundaries were meant to do. My house felt lighter, not perfect, but peaceful. And one evening, while we were all watching a movie, my son leaned his head against my shoulder, something he hadn't done in years, and whispered, "Mom, I know you tried your best." That was the moment I knew this chapter was closing. Not with revenge, not with victory, but with healing. And sometimes, that's the most powerful ending of all. If you stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you. That tells me you're someone who understands pain, growth, and the quiet strength it takes to keep going when life tries to break you. If this story spoke to you, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next one. I share stories like this to remind you that healing is real, that survival can turn into peace, and that no matter how heavy your past feels, your future is still being written. Turn on the notification bell so you're here when the next story drops, and leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from. You're not alone here. This is a community, and I'll see you in the next story.